Growing up, I was never enough in my father's eyes. No matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, he always found a way to belittle me. "You're just not cut out for success," he would say with a disappointed shake of his head. My younger brother, Ethan, on the other hand, was the golden child. Charming, ambitious in my father's eyes, and always given the best opportunities, even when he squandered them. I was the responsible one, the one who made practical choices, who worked hard, but to my father, I was a failure because I didn't fit his mold of success. He wanted me to be flashy, bold, and wealthy, someone he could boast about to his friends. But instead, I worked a steady job, saved every penny, and made cautious financial decisions. By the time I was 26, I had done what many my age could only dream of. I bought a house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. I worked multiple jobs, skipped vacations, and sacrificed nights out with friends just to make the down payment. I wanted to prove to myself that I could build a life on my own terms. But instead of being proud, my father scoffed. "You wasted your money on this? This tiny place? It's not even in the best neighborhood. A real man would invest in something worthwhile." His words stung, but I was used to the disappointment. I told myself it didn't matter. I had a home, a place that was mine, a safe space where I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Even though I had achieved something great, I couldn't shake the weight of my father's disapproval. It had always been like this. Every milestone I reached was somehow overshadowed by his criticism. When I graduated from college with honors, he barely acknowledged it. When I landed my first well-paying job, he said, "That's all. You could have done better." The pattern was exhausting, but I had long since stopped expecting anything different. Despite his lack of support, I was proud of my home. I spent my weekends fixing it up, repainting the walls, repairing minor damages, and furnishing it with second-hand but high-quality furniture. It was my sanctuary, a place that represented my hard work and independence. But my father's words echoed in my mind late at night. A real man would invest in something worthwhile. Was I not a real man in his eyes? Would I ever be? One evening, as I was working on some minor plumbing issues in the kitchen, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. "Ethan. Hey bro, Dad said you bought a place. That's cool and all, but why didn't you get something bigger? Something better?" I clenched my jaw as I read the message. It was just like Ethan to downplay my achievements. He had always been the golden child, getting everything handed to him while I worked for everything I had. I responded with a simple, "I like my house. It's what I could afford, and I'm proud of it." Ethan's reply came almost instantly. "Ethan. LOL, whatever man. Just saying, Dad expected more from you." I sighed and put my phone down. I shouldn't have let it get to me, but it did. It always did. A week later, my father called me out of the blue. "Come over for dinner," he said. "We need to talk." I hesitated. Every conversation with him felt like a battle, but against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived at my parents' house, the atmosphere felt different. Tense. My mother greeted me warmly, but my father was sitting at the head of the table, arms crossed, waiting for me. "You're wasting your potential," he said as soon as I sat down. "That house you bought, it's a mistake. You should have asked for my advice first." I felt my stomach tighten. "Dad, I worked hard for that house. It's mine. I don't see it as a mistake." He scoffed. "You always think you know best. That's why you'll never be truly successful. You need to start thinking about the bigger picture. Real estate isn't just about buying a place to live. It's about investment, power, and influence. You should have bought something with value." "It has value to me," I said firmly. "That's your problem. You think small." The conversation continued in circles, my father hammering into me that I had made the wrong choice, that I had failed once again. My mother tried to mediate, but she had long since learned that my father's opinion was immovable. By the time I left that night, my head was pounding. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need his approval. But deep down I wished, just once, that he would say he was proud of me. I wish I had seen the storm coming. The months following that dinner seemed to blur together, each day feeling like a repeat of the last. My father's words haunted me, but I continued to hold on to my house as a symbol of my success, even if my family didn't see it that way. But as time passed, something inside me began to shift. The house, which had once been a dream of independence, began to feel like a cage, a reminder of how far apart I was from my family, and especially my father. I had worked so hard for that house, but it was still never enough. There was always an invisible gap between us, one that no amount of work could bridge. One morning, I woke up early, coffee in hand, looking out the kitchen window at the small backyard I had worked so hard to transform. It was a modest space, but it had become mine in every sense. And yet, the moment my father's voice echoed in my mind, I couldn't help but feel the weight of disappointment on my shoulders again. It wasn't long after that I started hearing rumors. At first, it was small whispers in the family. Then, it became more frequent, and the stories began to take shape. Stories about how my father had been talking about me, about my failure, and how my life was headed down the wrong path. Apparently, he had been saying that I had no idea what I was doing with my life, that I couldn't manage money, that I didn't have the vision to succeed. The very words that he had used for years seemed to take root, growing deeper and more venomous as time went on. Ethan, my younger brother, wasn't helping matters either. He had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in my father's eyes. But this time, he was making things worse. Every time we spoke, he would casually drop comments about how Dad is just trying to help you see the bigger picture. Or how Dad's got a point, you know. He never outright said that I was a failure, but the implication was always there. It wasn't long before my father's opinions of me began to affect my relationships outside of my family. People who had once respected me now began to look at me differently. Friends, colleagues, even clients. There was this underlying judgment in their eyes, an invisible weight that seemed to press down on me. I had worked so hard to build my career, my reputation, but now it felt as though everything I had done had been overshadowed by my father's negative words. The house I had fought so hard for was no longer a victory. It was a failure in his eyes, and slowly, I began to internalize that judgment. Then one evening, it all came to a head. It was a Friday night, and I had just wrapped up a long week of work. I was exhausted, but as usual, I spent the last few hours of the evening fixing things around the house. Tightening a loose screw here, repainting a chipped corner there. It was my way of unwinding. The house had become my sanctuary, but now, it was a constant reminder of how much I still had to prove, even to myself. That night, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Ethan. Ethan, Dad wants to meet with you. He says it's important. The knot in my stomach tightened. Dad had never asked to meet with me unless it was to talk about what I was doing wrong, to point out my shortcomings, to tell me how I could be doing better. But I couldn't ignore him. If I didn't show up, it would be another strike against me in his eyes. I agreed, albeit reluctantly. The next day, I found myself sitting across from my father at the same kitchen table where I had grown up, the table where many of our confrontations had taken place. His eyes were steely, but there was a strange calmness to him now, like he had made up his mind about something. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat, bracing myself for whatever was about to come. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice calm but firm. "About the house." I knew what was coming. "What about it?" I asked, my voice tense. He looked me in the eye, his gaze unflinching. "It's a mistake. You can't afford it, and it's holding you back. I've been thinking about how to fix things." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Fix what?" "It's my house. I worked hard for it. I don't need fixing." He leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "You don't understand, son. You've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm the one who's been trying to help you avoid them. But you keep making the same ones over and over again. That house, it's part of the problem. You need to let it go." The words hit me like a punch in the gut. Let it go. He was talking about my home, the one thing I had worked so tirelessly to create. "You want me to sell my house?" He nodded. "It's the only way to move forward. You can't keep living in a fantasy. You've got to think about the bigger picture. Real estate is about investments, not about pride." I could feel the anger boiling inside me. "This isn't about pride, Dad. This is about the life I've built. You don't get to tell me what's best for me anymore." But he didn't back down. "You don't get it. If you want to succeed, you need to make sacrifices. And this house is your biggest mistake. If you sell it, you'll be free. You can start over." The conversation escalated, my frustration mounting with every word he said. How could he not see how hard I had worked? How could he think that my home was a mistake? I had built this place from the ground up, and to him, it was nothing but a burden. Before I knew it, I stood up, ready to leave. "I've had enough of this. I'm not selling my house, and I'm not listening to you anymore." I turned to leave, but my father's voice stopped me. "You'll regret this." I didn't respond. I just walked out, slamming the door behind me. The week after that heated exchange with my father was a blur of anger and disbelief. I had always known that my father saw the world differently, but for the first time, I was realizing just how much he misunderstood me. His constant need to control every aspect of my life had worn me thin, and this time, I was done trying to prove myself to him. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing unexpected challenges my way. A few days later, I received a letter from my mortgage company. It was the last thing I expected to see, a notice of default. I read the letter over and over, as if the words would change, but they didn't. Somehow, despite my best efforts, I had fallen behind on payments. The penalties had piled up, and now, they were threatening to take away the one thing I had worked so hard to keep, my home. I couldn't believe it. How had I let this happen? I had always been so careful, so diligent about paying my bills on time. But in the chaos of trying to maintain my career, the stress from my family, and the general pressures of life, I had missed a couple of payments. It had been the smallest of oversights, but it was enough to send everything into a downward spiral. I rushed to gather all the paperwork, hoping that I could sort things out before it was too late. I called my bank and tried to negotiate, but they were unmoving. I contacted the mortgage company, but they gave me little hope. The situation was dire. That's when I received the call from my father. I had avoided him since our last meeting, but this time, he didn't give me a choice. "You need to fix this," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "I told you this was going to happen. You should have listened to me." I took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that surged inside me. "I don't need your help. I'm trying to handle it." "Clearly you're not," he replied, his tone dripping with disappointment. "You've always been too proud to listen. You thought you could do it all by yourself, and now look where that's got you. You should have taken my advice when you had the chance." I could feel my heart racing. "I don't want your advice. I've told you that before. His voice hardened. You don't have a choice. I'm offering to help. You can't handle this on your own. I'm going to pay off the mortgage for you, but you have to sell the house. It's the only way forward. You've failed. Just accept it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My father, the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure, now expected me to accept his help. But on his terms. It was the same old story. He couldn't even offer support without making it feel like a punishment. I don't need your money, I spat. I don't need you to fix my problems. I'll find a way. Suit yourself, he replied, his voice indifferent. But remember, I warned you. I slammed the phone down, my entire body shaking with rage. This wasn't about the house anymore. It was about my father continuing to make me feel small, continuing to control me from afar. I wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. In the days that followed, I tried every option I could think of to avoid losing the house. I refinanced, I borrowed money from friends, I sold some of my belongings, but nothing seemed to work. The mortgage company wasn't interested in sympathy. They just wanted their money. And in the end, it wasn't enough. I received the final notice. The bank was repossessing the house. It felt like a gut punch. The one thing I had worked so hard for, the one thing I had built from scratch, was being taken from me. My father had been right in one way. My mistake had cost me everything. But I wasn't going to let him be the one to say, I told you so. The day the movers came to take my things out of the house, I felt a strange sense of numbness. I had no energy left to fight. I watched them haul my furniture away, piece by piece, as if I were watching someone else's life unfold. My house, the place I had dreamed of for years, was gone. But there was a part of me that was glad. Glad that it was over. Glad that the weight of trying to prove myself to my father was finally lifted, even if the price had been high. As much as I had loved that house, I knew now that it wasn't the solution. It was just a symbol of everything I had been trying to escape from. The need for approval, the desire to prove that I was enough. When the last of my belongings were packed up, I stood in the empty living room, staring at the bare walls. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't live in a place that was so filled with failure, so filled with the echoes of my father's disapproval. I left, without a plan, without any idea of what was next. I knew I would have to start over, but I was done with my father's voice in my head. I was done trying to live up to his expectations. I walked away from everything I had worked for, but I was finally free. In the weeks that followed the loss of my house, everything seemed to unravel. I had no place to call my own, no sense of direction. I stayed with friends for a while, but their hospitality only lasted so long. I couldn't bear the idea of being a burden, so I found a cheap apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom with creaky floors and cracked paint. But it was mine, and that alone gave me a sense of control I hadn't had in months. I spent my days searching for work, trying to rebuild my life from the ashes. But nothing came easily. My savings had been wiped out by the foreclosure, and every job I applied for seemed out of reach. I had always been careful with my money, but now I was struggling to make ends meet. The weight of my failure, of losing everything I had worked for, was suffocating. I tried to keep my distance from my family, but one day, Ethan reached out. He had heard about the foreclosure, and to my surprise, he seemed genuinely concerned. Ethan, hey man, I heard about the house. Are you okay? I know things have been rough between us, but you're still my brother. I stared at the message for a long time before deciding to reply. I'm managing. It's been a tough few weeks, but I'll be fine. His response came quickly. Ethan, look, I know Dad's been hard on you, but if you ever need help, you can come to me. You don't have to go through this alone. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Was this a genuine offer of support, or was he just trying to play the good brother to make himself look better in my father's eyes? I wasn't sure, but part of me longed for any connection, any reassurance that I wasn't completely alone. Thanks, Ethan. But I need to figure this out on my own. It was a polite way of saying no. I wasn't ready to ask for help from anyone, especially not him. Weeks passed in a blur of frustration. Every day was a battle to stay positive, to keep moving forward when it felt like the world was against me. Then one morning, as I was sipping coffee in my dingy apartment, my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it felt important. I picked up. Hello. Is this your name? The voice on the other end asked. Yes, speaking. This is Carla from the bank. I'm calling regarding your mortgage account. I felt my heart drop. I hadn't been able to pay my debts in months, and I was sure this call was to inform me that my credit was shot beyond repair. But instead, Carla's next words took me by surprise. Your father called us this morning, she continued. He's offered to pay off your remaining balance. The mortgage is paid in full. I couldn't speak for a moment. My father? After everything that had happened, after everything he had said, he was offering to bail me out? I didn't know how to respond. A part of me was humiliated, angry that he was trying to fix things in his own way, without asking for my input. But another part of me felt a strange sense of relief. I wouldn't lose my home again, but at what cost? How much does he want in return? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a brief pause on the other end. He didn't specify anything. He just wanted to ensure that the account was settled. I hung up the phone, staring at the empty space around me. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on my chest. My father had done what he had always done, come in at the last moment to take control. He had paid off the mortgage, but the strings attached were unspoken. He would want something in return, I was sure of it. I couldn't allow myself to be beholden to him again. I couldn't let him think that his money would fix everything, that it would erase the years of frustration, the years of feeling like I was never good enough. I packed my things and left my apartment, heading to the one place I knew would give me some clarity, the house I had lost. It was a surreal experience, walking through the empty rooms of my former home. The walls that had once held my hopes, my dreams, now stood silent. I walked from room to room, running my hand over the bare surfaces, remembering all the moments I had spent there, fixing the leaky faucet, painting the walls, making it mine. But as I stood in the living room, a wave of clarity washed over me. The house, this place that had meant so much to me, no longer defined me. I had been so focused on proving my father wrong, on showing him that I could succeed without his approval, that I had lost sight of what really mattered. I didn't need the house to feel like I was enough. I didn't need my father's money, his approval, or his constant reminders that I wasn't good enough. I had been living for someone else's expectations, trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. It was time to let go. The days after I left the house were a blur of confusion and self-reflection. I had spent so many years trying to meet my father's impossible standards that I had lost touch with who I really was. Now, standing on my own, without a home, without the approval of my family, but with a newfound clarity, I realized that I needed to rebuild my life from the ground up, on my own terms. The first step was taking control of my finances. I didn't want to rely on my father's money again, even though the offer was tempting. I had worked too hard to get where I was, and I refused to let his money define my worth. I found a part-time job at a local coffee shop while continuing to search for a more stable position. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. It gave me something to focus on, something to do every day that wasn't just a reminder of what I had lost. The days at the coffee shop were long and tiring. I'd wake up early, brew coffee for people who barely acknowledged me, and go home late, exhausted, but feeling like I was at least doing something meaningful. And slowly, I began to rebuild my savings. I kept a strict budget, avoiding any unnecessary expenses, and slowly but surely, I started to regain some of the stability I had lost. But it wasn't just my finances I needed to rebuild. I had to rebuild myself. I spent nights reflecting on my past, on the choices I had made, and on the person I had become. I realized that, for so long, I had been living in the shadow of my father's disapproval, thinking that his approval was the key to my happiness. But now, I understood that I didn't need anyone else's validation to feel worthy. One night, as I sat on the worn-out couch in my tiny apartment, a thought crossed my mind. It was time to do something for myself, something that wasn't driven by the need to prove anything to anyone. I decided to go back to school. It wasn't an easy decision. I had always been practical, always focused on making money and building a stable life. But deep down, I had always wanted to go into business, to learn the ins and outs of running a company, and to make a name for myself. My father had always told me that I would never be successful in the business world, that I wasn't bold enough, that I lacked the necessary drive. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need to prove anything to him. I was doing this for me. I applied to a local business school, using the money I had saved up. It wasn't a prestigious institution, but it was a step in the right direction. It would take time, effort, and sacrifice, but it was something I could do for myself. And this time, I wouldn't be doing it to win anyone's approval. I would be doing it because it was what I wanted. In the meantime, I kept working at the coffee shop, putting in long hours, but always focused on the future. Slowly, my confidence started to rebuild. I wasn't the same person I had been when I had lost everything. I was stronger, more determined, and more aware of what really mattered. But just as things started to feel like they were on the right track, I got a phone call that stopped me in my tracks. It was my father. At first, I didn't answer. The last time we had spoken, things hadn't ended well. He had criticized me for losing the house, and I had made it clear that I didn't need his help. I didn't want to get dragged back into the toxic cycle of his expectations. But as the phone continued to ring, something inside me told me I needed to pick up. I pressed the answer button, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity. "Hello, is this your name?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Yes, it's me," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I've been thinking," he began, and for the first time in years, I heard a different tone in his voice. "I want to apologize for everything. I've been hard on you, and I realize now that I've been wrong." I wasn't sure if I had heard him correctly. Was my father actually apologizing? "I've always pushed you too hard," he continued. "And I see now that I've only made things harder for you. I want to make things right, if you'll let me." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I was speechless. I had spent so many years waiting for this moment, for my father to admit that he had been wrong. But now that it was happening, I didn't know how to respond. "I don't need your money, Dad," I finally said, my voice steady but firm. "What I need is your respect. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I don't need you to bail me out or fix things for me. I just need you to understand that I'm doing this on my own terms." There was silence on the other end of the line, and I wondered if he was processing what I had said. Finally, he spoke. "I understand. I've been wrong, and I'm sorry." For the first time in a long while, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't an apology that made everything right, but it was a start. A small one, but a start nonetheless. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. My father's apology wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the years of pain and disappointment, but it was a step forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The next day, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. My journey wasn't over, but I was moving forward. I was building something for myself, something that no one could take away. And no matter what happened next, I knew I would be okay. The road to rebuilding was never easy, but it was the journey I had to take to finally realize that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's expectations. I had fought hard to get to where I was, and though the scars of my past lingered, I had learned to carry them with pride. As the months went by, I settled into a new rhythm. My studies at business school were challenging, but rewarding. I made friends who supported me, people who encouraged me to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard things got. The late nights of studying, the endless assignments, and the pressure of balancing work and school, each obstacle made me stronger. It was as though, for the first time in my life, I was truly living for myself. And that feeling, that freedom, was worth every bit of sacrifice. I was starting to believe in myself again. But despite my progress, there were moments when I couldn't shake the memories of my father's criticisms of the house I lost and of all the ways I had felt inadequate. Sometimes at night, I'd lie awake in my small apartment, replaying the words he had spoken, wondering if there was any truth to them. But then I'd remind myself of all I had done since then. I had rebuilt from nothing, with no one to help me but my own determination. I had made it this far, and there was no turning back. Then came a day that changed everything. I had just finished a particularly grueling final exam when I received an unexpected email. It was from the real estate agency that had originally helped me purchase the house. I hadn't heard from them in months, and I didn't think much of it at first. But when I opened it, my heart skipped a beat. The subject line read, "Your previous property, opportunity to reclaim." The message explained that the house I had worked so hard to buy was available again. The original owners had defaulted on their payments, and the property had been put back on the market. The agency had contacted me because the house was now being offered at a price even lower than what I had paid for it. For a moment, I was frozen. It felt like the universe was giving me another chance. A chance to reclaim not just a house, but my sense of self. I had worked so hard to get that home, only for it to be taken away from me. But now it was within my reach again. I didn't hesitate. I reached out to the agency immediately, and within days, I was making arrangements to purchase the house once more. It wasn't the same, of course. The memories of the loss, the way I had felt like a failure, would always linger. But the fact that I had worked so hard to get back to this point, on my own, without anyone's help, was something that no one could take from me. A few weeks later, I found myself walking through the door of my home once again. This time, it felt different. There was no judgment, no critical voice telling me that I wasn't enough. It was mine, truly mine. The house that had once been a symbol of failure had become a symbol of resilience, of everything I had fought for and everything I had earned. And as I stood there, in the kitchen where I had spent countless hours fixing leaky pipes and repainting walls, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't about the house. It was about the journey. It was about what I had learned along the way and the person I had become. I wasn't the man my father wanted me to be, but I had become the man I was meant to be. And in the end, that was enough. As I walked through the rooms, imagining how I would redecorate and make this house truly mine, I felt a deep sense of pride. I wasn't a failure. I was a fighter. And I had won.